Over the last 14 years, I've tried desktops, laptops, Windows, Mac, different specs, and if there's one thing I learned, it's that a computer is your lifeline for making music. Because along with a DAW, a computer is essentially all you need in today's digital world. However, figuring out what kind of computer you need can be quite overwhelming. So I've listed the 5 most important factors to consider for a computer as a music maker. The first question you want to ask yourself is, do you plan to work mostly at home or do you enjoy working from different locations? Because a desktop will work well for the former, while a laptop will be better for the latter. Second, do you prefer to work on Windows or on Mac? So say your current or previous computer runs on Windows and you're already using a DAW that is supported on Windows, then obviously upgrading to a new Windows computer makes sense, especially because Windows is generally more budget friendly than Mac and also allows you to upgrade specific components. On the other hand, if you're on Mac and you're using a software that is Mac only, like Logic Pro, then getting a new Mac makes sense. Now, while Mac does cost more of a premium, it's good to know that what you get is less prone to issues like viruses, has great build quality, and is more of a streamlined experience, which can be great if you are a synchronization junkie and want all of your devices to be in unison. Okay, so by now we've made our first choices, desktop or laptop and Windows or Mac, meaning it's time for the more technical choices, and these are the ones that ultimately matter most for your computer in terms of music making capabilities. So first things first, when we refer to specs, we really mean specifications, which are basically the body parts to a computer. They all work in harmony together to keep the computer up and running, and the most important of those parts are your CPU, RAM, and storage. So the CPU, otherwise known as processor, is really the brain of your computer. Like, it practically processes and performs all tasks needed, either one by one or at the same time if it's powerful enough. So essentially, the stronger the CPU, the faster things within your DAW will run and audio will play. Like generating synthesizer sounds and effects, think reverb, echo, can be heavy tasks for a processor once you hit play, because that's when these sounds basically need to be generated in real time in your DAW. So a stronger CPU will be better and faster at this. Now, of course, the question is, what is a strong CPU? In my experience, the i7, i9 and Xeon processors from Intel are all good, and I'd say the i7 has the best price performance ratio. But other things you want to consider besides the product type are the number of cores, which should be at least 4, but ideally 6, 8 or higher if your production needs are more advanced, as well as clock speed, which should be at least 2 GHz, but if you can get something around 3, then that's going to make the processing of real-time audio effects and loading times for instruments even quicker. Now, another very important piece to the puzzle is your RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory. And the RAM is the part of the computer that temporarily stores data of anything in use on the computer. So data can be stored on a hard drive, but sometimes relevant data is stored in your RAM. Like, say you inserted a sample library from Kontakt into your project, then your computer knows, okay, whenever he hits play, I need to be able to play the relevant Kontakt samples as quickly as possible. And because RAM is quicker than your hard drive, the underlying samples from the Kontakt library are basically pulled from your hard drive and stored in your computer's RAM upon loading the library, meaning it's instantly playable. Now, of course, you may have more plugins and more libraries running in your project at once, which means that the more RAM you have, the more samples and data your computer can keep in active memory simultaneously, without having to pull all of that from the slower hard drive or SSD whenever we hit play. Okay, so based on my experience, I would aim for 16 GB of RAM if you're on a budget, but if you're willing to spend a little more with the long term in mind, and if you're planning to use large sample libraries like the ones in Kontakt, then I would strive for 32 gigs for things to be able to run as smoothly as possible. I myself started at 8, upgraded to 16, then went to 32, which was great, and I only recently upgraded to 64, which is definitely plenty. Now, the final piece to the puzzle is figuring out how much storage you'll need. There's both SSDs, solid state drives, and HDDs, hard disk drives, and I would suggest going for an SSD given their much faster load and transfer times. Like, when copying files, an SSD will be able to do so much more quickly than a regular HDD, and also an SSD is much less prone to breaking. Now, for the amount of storage needed, you have to brainstorm a little, asking yourself, What plugins will I be using? Do I plan to have a large sample collection? And do I plan to save a lot of large files? Like, I myself love samples and sample libraries, and my sample collection easily exceeds about 500 gigs, but if you're not into using samples of real instruments in your songs, then you likely won't need to reserve as much space for sample libraries. And for many people, the sweet spot can be between 1 and 2 terabytes, with 1 probably being enough and 2 generally being more than enough, unless you plan to have tons of big files like sample libraries or high-res 4K video files, which take up a lot of space. However, the big pro of storage is that you're not necessarily limited to the stuff that's inside your computer. Like, if you run out of space on your computer, then you can always buy an external SSD. By the way, if you enjoy videos like these, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. So at this point you may be wondering what computers and specs I myself use over time. So let's go back in time 14 years. It's 2010, I'm 12 years old, and like any 12-year-old, I don't really have money to spend, but I do want to start making music. So all I have is my parents' Windows desktop with very basic specs. And in hindsight, this was great to begin with, because as a beginner, I did not have crazy needs as a producer, which is why if you already own a computer, I would definitely recommend using that to try music production first before upgrading. So after using that for a year or two, I fell in love with making music, and I became obsessed with the idea of owning a Mac, just because my favorite producers at that time, which were Hardwell and Nicky Romero, were using Logic Pro, which ran on Mac. So I got an iMac, I got Logic, I didn't like it as much as I liked FL, and I had to bootcamp my Mac to run Windows because FL was not fully supported on Mac yet. So I basically could have achieved the same results with a cheaper Windows computer. Lesson learned. I then upgraded to a Windows laptop from Asus sometime during high school with an i5 processor, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a 1 terabyte HDD. It was practical to bring my computer wherever I went, and the laptop served me really well from 2014 to 2019. But my projects became more complex because I was using more and more heavy contact libraries, and that's when I realized two things. One, I need another upgrade, and two, the pre-made computers from companies like Asus, HP, Dell all seemed to lack customization. Like, it was hard to find a laptop with 32 gigabytes of RAM and an i7 processor at a reasonable price. So building my own computer was the way to go. However, actually building it myself felt intimidating, so I had a company called PC Specialist build me a custom laptop, which had an i7 processor, 32 gigs of RAM, and 2 terabytes of storage. However, I'd say if you're somewhat tech savvy and if you're up for a challenge, then getting the components yourself and building your own computer is cheaper and could be a fun project. So for me, the custom built laptop performed really well for like 3 years, after which it started making a lot of noise. And also, despite the amazing specs, some of my larger session files still had trouble loading and playing back. So by then I had saved quite a lot from music to invest in something more top tier, which eventually would lead me to buy a refurbished 2021 MacBook Pro with 64 gigs of RAM and the amazing M1 Max processor. And this piece allows me to run any project at light speed and even run my heavy video editing software at the same time without making any sound. So despite the premium paid for a pre-configured computer as well as the Apple brand, I honestly feel it's been my best investment so far. Like, everything works like a charm, and that is vital given that music is my day-to-day job. So with all of that said, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below which computer you're using and if you're planning to upgrade anytime soon. Remember, there's no single route or one-size-fits-all approach to computers, so definitely also feel free to ask for advice in the comments below, as we have a strong community of music makers ready to help you. And with that said, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.